Solo Leveling by Gong. Chapter 65 Part 2 Memories of the Shadow Monarch. Whoosh! A great gust of wind accompanied by a blinding flash pushed the Fong Monarch and Frost Monarch back. The Fong Monarch quickly recovered, his eyebrows twitching. A fragment of luminosity! The man in front of them wore a robe and radiated a gold light, a hallmark of the rulers. It was a human borrowing the power of the rulers. But why was this person protecting one of the most powerful monarchs? The Frost Monarch yelled at him. The human you are protecting is the harbinger of tragedy. Are you planning to bring the end of all things by your own hands? Instead of answering, the man raised his hands up to his chin, each wielding a dagger in a reverse grip. He refused to step aside. The Frost Monarch scowled at the show of determination. The strange man was attempting to borrow a ruler's power while still in his human body, but human bodies were incapable of withstanding a god's power. Without the ruler taking total possession of the human body as the monarchs did, this vessel would crumble to dust. And yet, he's risking his life to help the Shadow Monarch's resurrection? What in blazes do the rulers think they're doing? The Frost Monarch exchanged looks with the Fong Monarch. Time was running out. The King of Beasts nodded, and the two monarchs charged at the man, one from the right and the other from the left. But the man skillfully blocked the relentless claws and spear while getting in some jabs of his own. He moved like a warrior who had seen his fair share of battles. Though he was facing certain death, he proved to be a tough opponent with his excellent skills and strength. Boom! The man in the robe blocked his opponent's mana-charged weapons and pushed them back. The two monarchs landed at a distance as they realized how difficult it would be to end this fight if they continued to battle in this manner. Tack! Tack! The man stood his ground instead of chasing after the two monarchs, as if his only purpose was to protect the Shadow Monarch's vessel. Who are you? The Frost Monarch demanded to know the man's identity, but he said nothing. It was then that the Fong Monarch transformed out of his werewolf form. I shall retreat. His sharp fangs regressed, and his long, pointy claws turned into the fingernails of a human. The Frost Monarch called after him. You're running away after we have come this far? Are you out of your mind? Can you not feel it? The Fong Monarch raised his head. His exceptional perception sensed a change in the air that made his body tremble. The mana in the air is crying out. The Shadow Monarch is coming. The Fong Monarch turned his eyes from the sky to the Frost Monarch again. I am leaving. Why you promised to help me battle the Shadow Monarch? The Frost Monarch sputtered. But the Fong Monarch shrugged. I promised to help with the Shadow Monarch in a human state, not his true form. I have no reason to stay. So you run away with your tail between your legs? And you call yourself the King of Beasts? Affronted, the Fong Monarch snatched the Frost Monarch by the collar. You do not understand because you have never faced the true power of the Shadow Monarch. The Fong Monarch had witnessed the Shadow Monarch survive an assault from 6 armies simultaneously. His own army of beasts, the army of the Monarch of White Lightning, the armies of 4 rulers. Such a monster was en route, so what did pride matter? Even if it meant being ridiculed for hiding behind the Dragon King, survival was the most important matter. It had been the right call to abandon the Monarch of White Lightning, the King of Demons, on the battlefield. And the King of Beasts was not willing to now destroy all his hard work by risking an encounter with the true Shadow Monarch. As the King of Beasts, the Fong Monarch's power came from the vitality of living creatures. Because of this, nothing frightened him more than death. The Fong Monarch didn't have time to argue with the Frost Monarch. He sensed death approaching quickly. He let go of the Frost Monarch's collar and generated a gate for himself. I wish you luck." With that, the king of beasts stepped through to the other side. The Frost Monarch glared at the closing gate. "Fool! How could someone who abandoned prey ripe for the taking be considered the best hunter in the world of chaos?" The Frost Monarch was ready to do whatever it took to kill the Shadow Monarch. Outside interference be damned. He had already cornered his prey at the edge of a cliff, so he certainly didn't need help from that coward. The determined Frost Monarch transformed into a spiritual body. Because he was not of this world, maintaining this form consumed a lot of his stamina. He needed to end this as quickly as possible before the Shadow Monarch awakened. "Taste the terror of Frost, puny human!" The Frost Monarch transformed into a raging snowstorm. The living storm thundered as it looked down at the man in the robe. "Face my true power!" Mana crystals in the air merged to create tens of thousands of icicles. They blew violently through the air like spears made of ice, each packed with enough power to instantly kill any human. The attack swept cars off the road like mere toys, and gales ripped buildings apart. Despite this, the man in the robe stood his ground and protected Jinwoo to the best of his ability, enduring scars from the countless ice spears. The Frost Monarch did not relent. "My soldiers!" Thousands of soldiers made of ice emerged from the snow that had piled up knee-high. "Charge!" The ice soldiers leaped at the man in the robe. He fought desperately to shake off the hunks of ice coming at him from all sides. SHHHK. The man stumbled as he was stabbed in the shoulder by an ice spear. He gritted his teeth and straightened back up, holding his own against the oncoming wave of soldiers. Seeing the man in the robe persist, the Frost Monarch joined the attack. He transformed into a crystalline manifestation of cold energy, and white vapor rose from his body as he approached. "Move!" His icy lackeys scattered out of his way. Standing in front of the man in the robe, the Frost Monarch opened his mouth wide. Bone-chilling cold began gathering in his mouth. The air itself began to freeze, and frost formed on the man's exposed chin from under the robe. The man in the robe knew he couldn't take too much more of this, but he also knew that if he dodged, Jinwoo would get hit. And so the man in the robe continued to stand his ground. The monarch's face twisted in fury. This human was merely borrowing the power of a higher being, so how dared he look arrogantly upon the face of his mighty power? A frightening burst of cold energy shot out of the furious monarch's mouth. Whoosh! The man crossed his arms in front of his chest to block the icy energy. His two arms froze from the blast, rendering him unable to move them. He could no longer defend himself from the following barrage of attacks. Pow! 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 With each punch, the man's upper body teetered, but his feet remained planted firmly on the ground. He endured the attacks even as blood pooled at his feet. "The gall of this mere human!" The Frost Monarch raised his right arm behind him. Cold energy coated his arm, forming a massive column of ice. Would the man be able to withstand this? The Frost Monarch dropped the ice column, aiming to not only take down the human, but also crush the Shadow Monarch's vessel. As the ice column descended upon him, the man raised his frozen arms above his head. He would protect Jinwoo to the last, even if it meant breaking his arms or being completely crushed. His body shone as he mustered every ounce of the ruler's power within him. Boom! A collision. But he felt no impact. What's going on? The man peeked up to see someone standing in front of him. Pitch black armor. A long red mane atop a black helmet. It was Igris, a loyal subject of the Shadow Monarch. To the Frost Monarch's disbelief, Igris had caught the column of ice with both hands and shoved it out of the way, perfectly blocking his attack. Igris the Bloodred? The appearance of a marshal could mean only one thing. The startled, Frost Monarch hurried to look behind the human. Sure enough, the vessel of the Shadow Monarch had vanished from sight. The Frost Monarch now understood what the Fang Monarch had been saying earlier. The mana in the air was practically vibrating as a reaction to the appearance of a transcendent being. Igris turned around, respectfully dropped down on one knee, and bowed his head. "Scraw!" Baru had appeared at the same time as Igris. He roared to announce the return of their master, and went down on one knee. Jiwu walked out between the two soldiers. He scanned the terrible destruction before turning to the Frost Monarch. Did the beast run away? It wasn't until he was finally facing the true Shadow Monarch that the Frost Monarch realized why the Fang Monarch was so frightened. Despite being the king of all things frozen, and being the embodiment of the shivering cold itself, the Frost Monarch couldn't stop quivering. Jinwu frowned. "I did not allow this." Puzzled, the Frost Monarch asked, "What?" "I did not allow him to leave." "What are you talking about?" Jinwu ignored the bewildered Frost Monarch and closed his eyes, expanding his perception beyond South Korea to locate the Fang Monarch's unique magic power signature. He was confident he could find the Fang Monarch as long as he was hiding somewhere on Earth, and not between dimensions. He eventually hit the jackpot as he detected the Fang Monarch in his hideout. Jinwu opened his eyes and smiled. "Found you!" As Jinwu focused all his attention on locating the beast, the Frost Monarch saw an opening. This was his one and only shot. Despite the gap in their powers, Jinwu was letting his guard down in front of his opponent. If he let this opportunity slip through his fingers, all that awaited him would be death. It was a last-ditch effort to avoid the encroaching shadow of death. "I must finish him with one strike." He wounded his right arm all the way back as mana gathered around it, and he generated the most powerful ice spear he could create. The monarch poured every drop of his power into this spear, so much so that the ground he stood on froze and began to crack. Then, when the ice spear in his right hand was impossibly huge, he sent it ripping through the air like a missile. Whyish! At the same time, his ice soldiers went after Jinwu like a pack of angry dogs. Whish! Right before the spear of ice pierced Jinwu's face, he opened his eyes. "Found you!" Time seemed to stand still, as if someone had pressed pause on a video. Well, it was more like time slowed down to the point that it looked like it had stopped. The spear of ice was moving slowly but surely. Behind the spear, Jinwu could see the Frost Monarch glaring angrily at him. He was also able to clearly see each movement of the ice soldiers surrounding him. This was how the Shadow Monarch saw things when he was in a battle. His cognitive ability was beyond human comprehension, so living objects appeared to be frozen in time. Jinwu casually surveyed his surroundings as the entire world seemingly held its breath. "I've felt this before." When had that been? Jinwu slowly recalled the moment he had been about to die at the hands of the stone statues. Time had drastically slowed for him back then as well. The Shadow Monarch was already with me at that time. Jinwu was coming to understand just how long the Shadow Monarch had been watching him after unlocking the full extent of his powers. As he looked around, he saw the backs of his two marshals. Oh! Although everyone else seemed to be frozen in time, Baru and Igris were slowly responding to the enemy's attacks. It was evidence of their unparalleled agility. As he looked upon them with pride, Jinwu then remembered the spear coming at him. Oh yeah! The spear inched closer like a bug crawling in midair. Jinwu used his power to stop the spear's advance. Ruler's authority. Of all the Shadow Monarch's abilities, this was the one he had put into practice the most. As soon as Ruler's authority was activated, mana wrapped around the ice spear and stopped it on the spot. Jinwu gasped in amazement as he saw the inner workings of ruler's authority for the first time. So it wasn't some invisible hand. Instead, it was mana that couldn't be seen by the naked eye, carried out by the will of the user. Awesome. When he increased his perception to the max, he could sense every single flow of mana around him. His eyes sparkled with delight. This was what the rulers had given the world to strengthen it. Though this world hadn't had a single ounce of mana before, it now overflowed with it. And with the Shadow Monarch's power, Jinwoo had free reign over it all. Ba dump, be a dump. His heart leaped as he felt the ebb and flow of the mana around him. Let's give it a try. Jinwoo approached his two marshals and put his hands on their shoulders. You two don't need to do anything. Baru and Igris immediately paused at Jinwoo's instruction. He walked past them. He had practiced ruler's authority whenever he'd had the chance. Now he could maximize his control of the mana. Jinwoo took a deep breath as he looked around at the ice soldiers. He was filled with appreciation for the Shadow Monarch and how much he had taught him through the system. He concentrated and took control of the mana around him. The entire area seemed to shake. Whoom! It literally took only a second for the powerful wave of mana Jinwoo had emitted to sweep away the massive number of ice soldiers. The Frost Monarch felt the mighty mana storm coming toward him as well. He rushed to create an ice barrier to protect himself. When the Frost Monarch deactivated the shield, he saw the remains of his ice soldiers strewn throughout the area. The powerful mana had swept away everything, including the blizzards he had conjured up. This was the power of the Shadow Monarch, also known as the greatest fragment of luminosity, and one of the two mightiest kings. How? The Frost Monarch was left trembling in fear. The Shadow Monarch was like a wall the Frost Monarch could never overcome. Satisfied by the results, Jinwoo nodded as he made eye contact with the frightened Frost Monarch. Even at this distance, Jinwoo was able to feel the Frost Monarch trembling. He still had a debt to settle with the Ice Elf. Jinwoo's expression turned cold as he remembered the late President Go, and he decided on his plan. He'd kill this one last, and give him time to wallow in fear about his imminent death. "You'll go last," Jinwoo said as he slowly sank into the shadow beneath his feet. "Wait here while I go after that beast." President Jinchul slammed his fist down on the desk when the live broadcast cut out. Bam! The last thing they'd shown was Jinwoo's body falling to the ground in defeat. He was devastated. If this desk hadn't belonged to the late President Go, Jinchul would have smashed it to pieces. Jinchul's tightly clenched fists shook. The subordinates, who were watching with him in the president's office, kept their mouths shut tight. A heavy silence fell on the room. However, Jinchul knew better than anyone that they didn't have time to just sit there and do nothing. "Has any guild reached the area?" "Yes, all 5 large guilds have arrived at the scene." Jinchul quickly rose from his seat. "The surveillance team must also head there, myself included." "It's too dangerous, sir." "What does that matter in this case?" The subordinates trying to stop him were at a loss for words as he glared at them. Korea had lost Jinwoo Sung, their strongest line of defense. That meant there was nowhere to retreat. Every hunter had to work together to stop those monsters, or there would be no tomorrow. As Jinchul hastily put on his jacket, he glanced at a monitor broadcasting another live feed. This particular camera was fixed on the sky, constantly filming the monolithic gate above Seoul. It gave Jinchul pause. Maybe Korea was already finished. His heart sank. Even if they got lucky and killed the monsters, the damage would be too great. Would the remaining hunters be able to handle a gate of that scale without Jinwoo? Thinking of both the monsters in the downtown area and the monolithic gate hit him with an overwhelming sense of despair. But Jinchul managed to shake his head. Even if every citizen of Korea thought the same thing, that wouldn't change the fact that someone had to fight on the front lines. This was the reason why hunters had been bestowed their powers. Jinchul bit his lip hard and banished the negative thoughts from his head. He was about to leave when one of his staffers hurriedly called out, "President Wu, sir!" Jinchul whipped around toward the large TV screen from which the voice of a reporter came with breaking news. "Our camera on location is back up." Based on the wide angle of the scene, it looked like the camera was shooting from the top of a faraway skyscraper, but that was good enough. The snowstorm that had been blanketing the area was being dispersed by an unknown force. Jinchul excitedly pushed past the employees, who had jumped to their feet in order to get closer to the monitor. As the fog lifted, they were able to see 5 people. No, make that 4 people and 1 insect. Jinchul knew exactly who the man standing in front of the insect was. "Hunter Jin Woo-sung," Jinchul blurted out as everyone cheered at the sight of the crushed remains of the ice soldiers. "Yay!" They thought he was gone. But not only was Jin Woo alive, he had put the enemy on the ropes. How could they contain their emotions? Tears welled up in Jinchul's eyes. There seemed to be one enemy left. The monster that used ice seemed immobilized by fear, like his feet had been nailed to the ground. The viewers had no idea what had happened inside the blizzard, but the tables had turned. Jinchul could tell that everyone around the world was watching the scene unfold. How would Jin Woo crush the monster? Jinchul stared expectantly at the screen. Strangely, it looked like Jin Woo merely said something to the monster before Jin Woo began to sink into the ground. The employees, who had been hugging one another and cheering, froze as Jin Woo completely disappeared from view. The flustered cameraman swung the camera around in search of Jin Woo, but was unable to find hide or hair of him. Huh? Equally confused, Jinchul rubbed his chin as another heavy silence filled the president's office. The Fong monarch was trembling inside his hideout in the jungle. It felt like a noose was tightening around his neck. He should have retreated earlier. Arguing with the Frost monarch had taken too much time. Back when he'd gone after that Brazilian hunter, the earth had been full of easy prey for him. It had been exciting to be freed from the gaps between dimensions on these new hunting grounds. He never would have imagined the Shadow Monarch had descended on this world with such a malicious scheme. A human pretending to be the Shadow Monarch was one thing, but he refused to fight the actual Shadow Monarch. The power of the Monarch of Destruction was needed to take on the Shadow Monarch. There's nothing for it. I'll have to hunker down until the Dragon King arrives. The beast lay on a bed made of leaves and tree branches. Denizens of chaos, known by the humans as magic beasts, lay at his feet. These powerful creatures were his royal guard, but they purred like pets and nuzzled his hand as the king stroked them. His hand froze as he sensed something strange. The beasts first stood on end as their instincts kicked in. The Fong monarch got goosebumps on the back of his neck, and they all fixed their gazes on the same spot. The monarch's eyes narrowed until they were slivers. The shadow of a nearby tree appeared to be moving. The Fong monarch picked up on the scent of death inside his hideout. He nervously muttered, "Is that?" Something was slowly rising from the tree's wiggling shadow. The human? No, the Shadow Monarch? The beast was unable to identify his opponent, but every single one of his senses was telling him that the man's presence felt identical to the one who almost did him in those many moons ago. Whoever it was, this trespasser possessed ultimate power in his hands. He chased me here? The king of beasts shuddered as the terror of death permeated his bones as Jin Woo rose from the ground. Grrr. In an attempt to protect their master, The beasts bared their fangs to intimidate Jin Wu. One of them dashed toward him. It was a magic beast that resembled a wildcat with 3 red eyes, and it was one of the most savage beasts from the world of chaos. Roar! Dozens of sharp fangs gleamed inside its mouth. Unfazed, Jin Wu stared as the savage S-rank magic beast grew closer. The Jin Wu of the past would have readied himself to fight it, but it posed no threat to him now. Bam! Before Jin Wu could bother to deal with the savage beast, the Fong Monarch leaped at it and crushed its head into the ground. He pulled his fist out of the ground as the wildcat's limbs went limp. Why did he just kill his own soldier? The Fong Monarch lowered his body and head subserviently as Jin Wu watched him curiously. He shakily pleaded, "Oh, Shadow Monarch, I, the King of Beasts, do not wish to fight you. Please forgive my transgressions and accept me as your ally." His beastly instincts had kicked in. If you cannot fight or flee, submit. The Fong Monarch was an animal by nature, so he cast aside his pride. "The Dragon King will soon descend upon this land with his soldiers. When that time comes, my army of beasts and I will be by your side." He lowered his body as much as he could. Whimper. The savage creatures behind the monarch wet themselves as they remained paralyzed in complete terror. Survival was everything to these creatures, so they feared nothing more than the approach of death. Jin Wu looked down at the King of Beasts with his tail between his legs. "Fine." A smile spread across the Fong Monarch's lowered face. "What a fool. That can't be the true Shadow Monarch. If it were, he wouldn't have made the mistake of forgiving the one who had not only betrayed him once before but also attempted to destroy the vessel of his rebirth." The King of Beasts had bought some time thanks to the human's soft heart and ignorance. How could he bring himself to obey the Shadow Monarch while he had the sin of prey mixed in? He would pretend to work with him until the arrival of the Monarch of Destruction. "When the time comes, I will rip your body apart with my own hands and devour you." It was no wonder he couldn't hold back a grin. "I swear my loyalty to Wai." The King of Beasts recoiled in fear after meeting Jin Wu's frigid gaze, putting a considerable distance between himself and the Shadow Monarch in a flash. The beast's face paled as Jin Wu noted, "First, we need to settle the debt between us." The King of Beasts forced out, "Debt? You mean what happened back then?" Having inherited the Shadow Monarch's memories, Jin Wu was well aware of how the Fong Monarch and the Monarch of White Lightning had attempted to betray the King of the Dead in the past. But it had nothing to do with Jin Wu. He took out one of the Kamish Wrath daggers from the other dimension the system had referred to as his inventory. With the index finger of his free hand, he indicated 5 spots on his own chest. "These are the 5 spots where your claws penetrated my chest." He vividly remembered the awful pain. "If you can withstand 5 of my attacks, I will forgive you." In other words, the Fong Monarch would have to survive 5 fatal wounds. The King of Beasts let out a roar fitting of a beast as he realized that the Shadow Monarch had never had any intention of forgiving him. "How dare you trick me? Me, the King of Beasts." The Fong Monarch triggered his true form and transformed into a humongous wolf. It was smaller than pictured in the Shadow Monarch's memories, though it was because this wasn't the wolf's home dimension. Whatever his size, the King of Beasts possessed enough power to destroy all of Earth. The furious Fong Monarch bellowed, "This may be the end of the line for me, but I'm going to take you down with me." Shunk! At that moment, a cold breeze blew past the wolf's face. He turned to try to follow Jin Wu's movements as the human vanished from in front of him. Jin Wu had stopped behind the wolf and was slowly turning toward him. "That's one." The wolf noticed the awfully powerful black aura around Jin Wu's entire body and swallowed hard. There was no doubt that the man in front of him was the true Shadow Monarch. His movements were identical. Plop! Something hit the ground. The wolf couldn't help himself. He glanced down to see a huge ear on the ground. A wolf's ear had been placed at his feet. Soon, the Fang Monarch felt extreme pain as blood gushed from his wound. Gnashing his teeth, the wolf looked up and saw a second dagger in Jinwu's other hand. Jinwu gripped both Kamish Wrath daggers as he delivered his final verdict to the wolf. That leaves 4. The Frost Monarch was surrounded. Jinwu had left him in a tough spot. Fleeing would be the best option, since he had no chance of winning here, but he eyed the 2 marshals of the Shadow Army. Never mind the bastard and who's healing a ruler's vessel. The remaining shadow was the problem. Igris the Bloodred, one of the 2 wings of the Shadow Army, kept his eyes on the Frost Monarch. The soldier's nickname was the Death Knight, and he was a powerful warrior who had fought on countless battlefields and killed countless enemies under the command of the Shadow Monarch. This was the opponent the Frost Monarch needed to be most wary of. With that being said, the ancient ice elf was a monarch, not some common foot soldier. At his best, the Frost Monarch should have been able to defeat both marshals without a problem. The issue was that the marshals possessed the power of regeneration. They would keep coming back for more until the Shadow Monarch ran out of mana. This did not bode well for the Frost Monarch, who lost much stamina after utilizing his true form. Additionally, attacking them was the same as informing their master of his moves, as every Shadow soldier was connected to the Shadow Monarch. Even if the Frost Monarch succeeded in defeating the major generals, it would call the Shadow Monarch back to this location. The Frost Monarch needed to prevent that at all costs. Then, he turned his body to create a gate to escape. Whip! Igris blocked the monarch's path. The soldier shook his head and tapped the hilt of his sword at his waist as a clear warning to not do anything stupid. Whip! The Frost Monarch turned and was met by the ant's mandibles. Scraw! The ant had been healing the arm of the interloper. If he was here then, the monarch spotted the fully healed interloper walking toward him. You bastards! The Frost Monarch was trembling with rage at the enemies surrounding him. You worms dare to! The furious king's screech shook the land. The air began to turn frosty, and dark clouds gathered overhead once more. How long do you think you can last against me? Igris pulled out his sword. Baruf flashed his sharp claws, and the man in the robe brandished a dagger in his hand. But before they could clash, the Frost Monarch sensed a disturbance in the air. The other 3 followed his gaze to see a shadow quivering. The Frost Monarch bit his lower lip. He needed to buy some time. Shadow Monarch! Jinwu rose up from the nearby shadow. Love that the cooldown period is gone. Any restrictions to his power had been lifted with the deletion of the system. Jinwu was able to return in a snap to where he had been earlier. He looked at the Frost Monarch and tossed over the object in his hand. The Frost Monarch caught it and stared. Is this? It was a wolf's ear. There could be only one wolf with an ear that large. You mean to say that you killed the Fang Monarch in the few minutes you were away? The surprised monarch bellowed. Instead of responding, Jinwu summoned his 2 daggers just as he had done with the King of Beasts. The Fang Monarch's blood that dripped from them was still warm. The Frost Monarch trembled as the powerful man before him chose his next target. The 2 marshals and the man in the robe retreated when they spotted the black aura rising from Jinwu's shoulders. Jinwu tightened his grip on the daggers. He had held the enemy on ice for long enough. It was time for payback. The Plague Monarch, the Fang Monarch, and the Frost Monarch. Their deaths would be a warning to the rest of the monarchs. When Jinwu smoothly rushed at him, the ancient ice elf quickly. generated ice arrows to fire at him. "You bastard!" Despite being hastily made, the magic arrows had been created by a higher being, so they were deadly, powerful enough to fell an S-rank hunter with one shot. Countless arrows rained down on Jin Woo. Fictitiously, the Frost Monarch made a concerted effort to stop Jinwoo's approach. Grah! But Jinwoo's hands were faster than the arrows. He didn't slow down as he swatted away the ice arrows coming at him. Grewa! Fictitiously, despite the barrage of arrows, Jinwoo repelled every one of them and reached the Frost Monarch. Shunk! Jinwoo thrust Kamish's wrath into the Frost Monarch's shoulder where Jinwoo had stabbed a dagger once before. He did this to remind the Frost Monarch of the late President Go. Arg! The Frost Monarch looked up and screamed from the intense pain. The monarch quickly spat cold energy from his mouth before Jinwoo could stab him with a second dagger, but Jinwoo fully covered his mouth with a hand. MMPH. As the Frost Monarch thrashed at the cold energy trapped in his mouth, Jinwoo stabbed the monarch in the chest with his dagger. Crack! The Frost Monarch's ribs shattered as his heart was penetrated. It mirrored the attack Jinwoo had received earlier. Arg! Having already disposed of two other monarchs, Jinwoo was confident that this attack would kill the Frost Monarch. The beast died on my fourth attack. Jinwoo's eyes gleamed. How many attacks can you take? The terrified Frost Monarch looked into the eyes of the King of the Dead, the greatest warrior who had taken down their enemies on countless battlefields. The Frost Monarch finally realized whom he had offended, and he quaked in fear. Then the dagger stuck in the monarch's heart was dragged downward, slicing his body in two. Guy!